Okay. In looking at week 2 and what we're focusing on, your text readings are focused primarily on expatriate experiences going to another country of their sojourn, and then the re-entry process, and also looking at long-term cross-cultural adaptation. And your discussions focus mainly on culture shock. Now, the reason for this, and I realize that culture shock tends to be more internationally focused, but I would also say it's not completely internationally focused. You can experience light forms of culture shock even going into a culture in your same neighborhood or that you're just not as experienced with. And experience some light forms of culture shock, although we probably wouldn't call it culture shock. That's a little extreme and usually reserved for just international experiences, because those tend to be the biggest cultural jumps. But I just want to say that I think it's relevant to intercultural training any way you cut it. So let's talk a little bit about it. One thing that our book looks at is the difference in the theories of the U theory and the W theory. Of course, the U theory is when you go to another country, you start off pretty high, and we might even have a little plateau and then the dip. But you get there, it's exotic, you're excited, those sorts of things. And then when you realize you're in a very different place and you start to question your own cultural identity and where do you fit and how do you understand other people and you don't feel like you can connect, these sorts of questions, it's a very social psychological process. Then you kind of go through a low, and people experience it pretty differently. Or show it pretty differently. When I was ESL training, or I was going through an ESL training before I was working with Halima, my Somali Bantu student, who I mentioned before, we heard stories about one woman who did ESL training, and for the first 2 months with her student would just cry the whole 2 hours of their lesson. And the tutor would just sit there and hold her hands for the 2 hours, and that was all that she could do. And that was probably the best thing she could do for that woman at the time. But this woman had gone through such extreme culture shock, and that was how she was reacting to it. With Halima, this woman is amazing. She's strong. One thing you have to know about refugees is if you understand their experience, a lot of them have spent, say, 10 years in a refugee camp and had to get all this documentation together to get to the United States. I mean, they're fighters. Refugees aren't people who just fled and easily got here. Most of them went through a huge process that is amazing. They've had to go through it in different languages, in hugely different cultures, and they've succeeded. So with Halima, there were no real visible signs of culture shock. I noticed that she got sleepy a lot during our lessons and when we were there. And she wasn't quite sure how to interact with me for quite a while, but she'd never really let it show. And she had 7 children, so she was pretty busy. But, the thing is that I'm sure she was going through culture shock. I'm sure that, inside, she was dealing with a lot of stuff, and even though she didn't cry during our sessions, I think maybe sometimes she just got tired because of all this new situation and what she was going through. So the U is then, as you're adapting to the culture, you're coming back up, you're feeling better about your place, you're feeling better about your identity and your fit within this new culture. And then the W idea is for re-entry. So, and this is interesting, re-entry catches people, I think, a little more than when you go to a culture. I think a lot of people expect to have a very different experience and to be homesick and to go through sort of that psychological turmoil when they go to a new place. What a lot of sojourners don't expect is to go through that again when they come home. So as I was saying, one of you mentioned your experience when you were traveling abroad, and you were, I think, in Germany during 9/11, and the different experience you had when you went back to the U.S. post 9/11 and the different place it was. I think it's easy to forget that culture and places and communication systems are all dynamic and ever changing. So it's easy for us, being away from a place for a long time, to assume when we go back that it will be the same, and it isn't exactly the same. Things have changed, the culture has shifted in certain ways, and there's small nuances, but when you're excited to go home and excited to go back to place and the place isn't exactly the same, that can be a pretty traumatizing experience. The other thing that people don't expect is that they will likely feel different when they do go home. They will have changed as a person and relate to things a little different. Things that seemed simple to them before, they may take pause around or give a second thought to. So re-entry is actually something I think catches people a little more off guard than the initial culture shock. And it can really be as difficult, as challenging, and sometimes as traumatizing if somebody isn't prepared or even realizing what's going to happen when they go back. It can be pretty shocking. So that's the W that we're talking about, is going through culture shock again, then the second curve when you go back to your native country. We're going to read a great article, I think in week 3, by Craig Engstrom on, he calls it cultural autonomy, and I call it self-reflexivity, and his argument for going through a process of understanding yourself and cultural identities, and to be kind of secure in that before you go through a sojourn, for both reasons, for going through initial culture shock and then re-entry culture shock. So we'll look forward to that. Let's see. I guess I wanted to briefly mention kind of the differences that we read about in chapter 14 this week, about assimilation and melting pot ideas and this more pluralistic notion. It's interesting, and we can talk a little bit about the melting pot and assimilation in our discussion boards if it comes up. But as the book says, those theories have mostly been, those theories were kind of set out by the majority group that was hoping that minority groups would come and just become a part of their culture and a part of them. And that really never happens in mass. You have people who create their own communities within communities. So you have very different cultures living amongst each other. And if you're in Denver or wherever you are, you don't have to go very far to find a very different cultural community right by you. And that's the idea of pluralism. And I do like this idea of asking the two questions that the book poses. One, are cultural identity and customs of value and to be retained? And two, are positive relations with the larger society of value and to be sought? And I think that we have to pay close attention to these questions as intercultural trainers, because I think that we generally want both of those answers to be yes. We want to move towards integration, where you're able to value your own cultural identity wherever you go as the learner, but you're also able to value this new cultural identity, or the new cultural group that you're being integrated with, or that you're trying to be a part of. So this valuing of self and other cultures, I think, is generally what we want to strive for as intercultural trainers. So knowing that, we can use those two questions, almost turn them into our learning outcomes. We need to work with our learners for them to understand self, their own cultural identities, that there are value in those identities, and help them to be secure in those and who they are, but at the same time allow them to develop an appreciation for different types of cultures. And I think this really gets at the crux of why I think self-reflexivity is so important in intercultural training, and why we talk about it so much. And those of you who had culture and conflict with me, this is why we spend so much time talking about your own culture, and that's why we start there. Because I really do think it takes those two pieces, and I think oftentimes self-culture identification and understanding is the part that gets lost. So I think it's super relevant to intercultural training. Okay,